we'd like to welcome Anshul Sharma, the co-founder and co-CEO of Redwing Labs. Thank you, Anshul, for being here on a Saturday.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roopa. It's fun to be on a Saturday over here.
Awesome. So, Anshul, we were just chatting that you haven't slept in a couple of days, so we're going to keep this as sober as possible, right? And I think the best piece about having this conversation with you is one, when anybody looks you up, right, on Google, or if they want to look you up on LinkedIn, two interesting facts stand out. One, you're an aerospace engineer yourself, and second is you guys have won awards from NASA, Boeing, and multiple others, right? Airbus, and so many others. How did it feel? I mean, first of all, let me ask you the first question. How did Redwing Labs come to you, guys, right? Like an idea. And what prompted you to go get into this space?
Yeah, all of my co-founders, we all met in college basically. They're all my seniors. We initially started up competing in a lot of these competitions, which were mostly aerospace focused basically. These were basically drone or robotics competitions, which were focused on aerospace, specific problems about drone delivery, a little bit more on the military application side. That's when we basically started to get a hang of what exactly is needed in terms of a drone logistical tech space, basically, and also the perspective of what these sort of companies or organizations like NASA or someone else basically really looks at in terms of from an aviation standpoint. So I think the journey really started for us in college time when we were starting to do these competitions. We initially started by winning IT Bombay's Tech Fest, basically, which was more of a local, domestic competition, basically. And then that led us to a chain of events, basically, where we were going back again to the US multiple times, essentially, for these competitions, which were mostly by NASA and Lockheed Martin.
Sure.
When that sort of happened, it sort of also built a little bit more confidence over the period of about 2 years, because initially it was not that great, but then at the later parts of the years we started excelling in it, getting between first to third ranks of those parts. And since these were global competitions, we were feeling like that there is something over here to be really looked at, not just from short-term lens, but more from a long-term lens. The interesting twist which happened was actually in 2016, when my that time team member and now also co-founder Arunabha, basically, or as I call him, Oro, he got diagnosed with testicular cancer right after we came off from Florida.
Oh,
Yeah, right, like 10 days later, basically. That was, and he had to go through that chemotherapy cycle for about, I think, 8 to 9 months period.
sure.
I think once that period got over, there was definitely a pinch, basically, that it makes sense to basically do something in healthcare. And the background that we had during that time in aerospace and robotics, basically, I think we started basically, brainstorming or just playing around with what can be done. I think the one thing which keeps standing out was basically the difference of accessibility, or the problem of accessibility, number one, and secondly the problem of just the supply chain, essentially, in healthcare in general. And from there on, we didn't act on it immediately, but we were basically just asking around people and just like keeping it on the backside, whereas we were carrying on with our usual lives. And Oro after that went on to work for the Indian Intelligence Organization, basically, for flying drones, Israeli drones for sensitive regions in India.
Sure.
And I was in Singapore during that time. And after, I think, sorry, a point of time, we realized that it's time to like just act on it, and that's when we, I think, pulled the trigger. And we were joined with Rishabh as well, who was also with us in our college time. and then the three of us basically started in 2018 the company to really look at the problem of accessibility essentially from that perspective.
Sure. So this seems very interesting because there's a personal angle to the reason why that you guys went in for Red Wings. And as far as I understand, this is a last mile. You're solving for last mile through drone delivery, correct?
Yeah.
And is there a specific thing that you're focusing on? Any specific domain? You spoke about health tech, right? Within health tech, are there specific things that you guys focus on?
Yeah. So I think number one aspect that we're focusing on is the aspect of cold chain itself.
Right.
We're basically building virtual cold chains. Virtual cold chain is this very simple concept that it's like me telling you that if you need an ice cream at your house, you don't need to have a refrigerator because I'll be delivering that ice cream to you on demand while maintaining cold chain. And now you can import that same analogy into healthcare. Is that since we're delivering, these sort of cold chain medical products like blood, vaccines, bunch of other like cardiac medicines, snake antivenoms, and bunch of other sensitive medical products, which typically require cold chain. The last mile hospital doesn't need to have that much amount of dependency on the cold chain infrastructure.
Right.
So that's one layer, which is reducing the capex and opex for the part. The second is just the wastage element, basically. India, on an average, basically has a wastage rate of, let's say, any healthcare product. Typically, the most used one we can use at blood. Blood is around, I would say, 13 to 14 lakh units. Those are the number of units that is wasted.
Wow.
And the collection is 30 lakh units, basically.
Oh God.
Yeah, so it's a real challenge, basically. Even if right now in Bangalore, if you are trying to source, let's say, positive blood, the most commonly used blood in the middle of the metropolitan city, you will have to, rely on sort of these donor networks or, bunch of different stuff that is assuming that,
even after so many years, even after having so many hospitals, you're saying.
True. So there's a real challenge basically on the aspect of blood part, and then similarly there are specific product challenges which happens as well. Another interesting thing which happens with blood is that usually when you donate a blood, that is a whole blood, and what you typically would need in a surgery, let's say if you need platelets or plasma or any sort of different product, that is a sub-product of the blood itself.
Okay.
Typically, the blood needs to be put into a central processing unit, which will then feed out these blood products. India usually doesn't follow that step because there are not many central processing units or component separation facilities, as it's called. So usually what happens is that if even a patient needs platelets or a specific product, it's given whole blood, and the rest of the products which could have been extracted from that whole blood is wasted essentially by just part. So those are very nitty-gritty challenges essentially with just this complex logistical problem, which is very difficult to solve with a traditional last mile logistics solution, basically. Last mile logistics or a milk run model, basically. Milk run models is how traditional logistical players operate, is that you're basically putting in 10 to 12 parcels or like delivery goods essentially into one single vehicle, and then that delivery vehicle is going around on a single trip delivering to all of these places. With healthcare as well, it works in a similar way, but healthcare is something which has an element of routine deliveries essentially, and at the same time it has an element of emergency deliveries, which is that anyone can meet with an accident at any point of time, anyone can have postpartum hemorrhaging, there are different bunch of emergencies which happen in surgeries, which requires that component of emergency as well. And then when that emergency strikes, it happens every day, but that entire procurement cycle, the lack of visibility on what sort of drug is available, sourcing that part, and who is taking responsibility for that sourcing. All of that is a very sort of unorganized part, and at the same time a really big problem statement essentially to work on. So the way that we are basically looking at we can't solve like all the problems, so we're looking at solving very specific problems within this problem statement, which is one, it makes sense to basically centralize inventory and then deliver it on demand. Hence,
Right.
we're doing it in a hub and spoke manner. We're basically building sort of an airport for drones and having a pharmacy at the central station essentially to deliver these products on demand. That is working out for both routine care and for emergency care, basically.
Sure.
The goal is to create an agile system which can cover this spectrum, which is between routine and emergency, within a stipulated time period of about 90 to 120 minutes, essentially.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Within 90 to 120 minutes.
Yeah, within 90 to 120 minutes, about for a distance of 50 kilometers aerial. So by road, it could be about 70, 75, depending on which sort of region that you're living in,
Sure.
basically.
Sure.
So that's one aspect. The second aspect is just that by arranging, like by doing this sort of delivery mechanism, or by centralizing inventory and then delivering it on demand, your cost structure of a healthcare system really changes, basically. Since you're delivering on demand and you're forming a virtual cold chain, the hospitals basically don't need to, rely so much on their capital and on their cold chain infrastructure, which in turn, has their effect on the capex and opex.
Right.
And third is for these pharmaceutical players themselves or these products themselves, which is that it really prevents wastage, basically, because you're delivering on demand rather than how it's happening right now, which is in a very routine-based manner, basically, and an unpredictable mechanism. That's the main element. The interesting thing to look at is that any hospital basically is procuring in a given day, is procuring a number of products that they might or might not need at a quantity they might or might not need. They have a guesstimate basically that yes, this is a safe part, but they don't have an exact visibility basically that an accident victim will come or at some other emergency basically will happen basically throughout the day.
Sure.
Hence, this is what the paradox of access versus wastage in healthcare is. Access versus wastage paradox in healthcare is that if you try to solve for access, that means you stock up a lot of inventory at the last mile, and as a result of which wastage happens. Whereas if you try to solve for wastage, you don't stock up a lot of inventory at the last mile, and as a result of which access to a patient basically gets hampered. So we're trying to solve this paradox basically by orchestrating drones in our network.
Sure, sure. So let's just deep dive and talk a little bit about, when you spoke that 50 kilometers aerial radius that you can transport, let's say, a blood, right? That needs to be given to a patient. How does it work from a technology perspective? Yeah, one, you're saying it's like a virtual cold storage. Yeah, and how does this really work from behind scenes?
Yeah. So just from a higher level, one aspect is that first of all we need to enable drone delivery for that, and that's where a little bit shift basically happens in how drone technology or drone technology has been existing till now versus how it's needed for drone delivery.
Sure.
And this is where the aspect of regulations and all of those really come in. So the simplest way to put it is that drones currently are being used for multiple level applications. They're used for obviously surveillance purposes, thermal inspection, insurance, mapping. Right now, there's a huge project in India, perhaps the largest one in the world of mapping, called Samvitva program, which is basically tasking up collecting digital sort of digital imagery for the villages in India, essentially. That's perhaps one of the largest mapping projects, essentially, which has been taken up by any country as well. So there's been a bunch of different applications from drones which are existing. But what happens when you try to come towards this element of drone delivery? You're trying to operate like an airline, basically.
Okay.
You need clearances immediately. You'll be flying day in, day out, 24/7, 365, on call, all of those aspects. Now, when you're trying to enable that, in the early days, that is where we are at right now, in the early days of this drone delivery, what happens is that aviation functions from the perspective of safety primarily, which is that What happens in the case of bird strike? Can the aircraft still fly? And what happens in the case of motor failure? Will it just come and hit on someone's head, or all of those different scenarios that people really talk about. Will you be spying on people? And all of those aspects really concerns really come about. So from a tech perspective, what you need to do primarily is to shift what is existing in a sort of a robotic space, and bring it more towards an aviation space, basically.
Right.
So you're taking this robot, you're making it more sophisticated. It has the elements of autonomy and all of the propulsion and all of those electric qualities in it, and then you're basically adding or shifting it more towards an aviation product, which requires redundancies, which requires very low latency communications and all of those technical aspects, essentially, of aerospace part.
Right.
And that is what is basically needed to enable drone delivery. So it's very different ball game to just buy a drone and fly it for like a kilometer or maybe like 500 meters, but it's a different ball game when you're talking about delivering for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers in a realistic environment, day in, day out, with consistency and repeatability, especially when you're looking at drone delivery aspect, because this is the first layer of an autonomous robot delivering anything. At least that's how we view it, that India will basically see this as the first layer of adoption of in the category of autonomous robots. We believe that drone delivery will happen first rather than self-driving cars happening earlier. And the reason for that being that the variables on ground are very different than the variables in air, because these are autonomous systems. So these don't have typically a pilot or a driver as well behind them. That means when you're driving a car on the road, you have to get all of the LiDAR sensors to have a 3D volumetric map of the surroundings real time, and do all that decision making frameworks, and that's where your complex data collection mechanism, LiDAR technology, and all of the camera sensor fusion technology really comes in to make those decisions in real time, as it's happening in the US with Tesla and a bunch of other companies. In India, it's a little bit slightly tricky, because on ground, when you're talking about enabling a self-driving car on the road,
Right.
the variables are a little bit more. I do believe it will happen very soon, and there are certain regions which will see it faster, where there are clear, defined road rules, basically, and that sort of infrastructure. But the variables are still higher.
Sure.
The data collection does take time. And now when you're looking at the same technology and lifting up in air from an autonomous robot standpoint, the variables become a little bit lower, basically, because you're flying in air. So there are other aircrafts and like birds and all of those parts, but those are still much comparatively lower, and it's easier to solve for, basically, as compared to the ground-based data system.
Got it.
On the back end, I think the primarily focus is just doing this, making safe autonomous deliveries basically happen. And to enable that, you're using a bunch of different sensors, essentially, a lot of data. You have to train a lot of data, a lot of test flights, a lot of redundancies. So you're taking the best practices which are existing in aerospace, you're taking the best practices which are existing in autonomous space, basically, and also some borrowing it from the robotic space, and then bringing it together in a marriage of robotics and aviation, basically.
Wow, it's complicated. Yeah, there are three different aspects that you're actually combining, right? There's robotics, you said, then there is aeronautical, basically aerospace,
Yeah.
and then you also, I'm sorry, I missed the third piece.
The
Robotics.
autonomous.
Yeah, the autonomous as well. Yeah. Interestingly, you mentioned about regulatory. Let's talk a little bit about that for India. Yeah, when we actually focus on how this could, you are a Bangalore-based startup.
Yeah.
Yeah. How much have you been able to execute this within India, and how has this gone about for you? Especially because we've 2019, everyone's aware, COVID really hit every part of the world.
2020.
Sorry, 2020. Yeah. So how did you see this actually go about? With the drone technology, were people welcoming?
Yeah, so there's been, I think, bunch of different perspective really. Last time, exactly the same time of the year when the lockdown really started, we got a really bunch of different requests basically, which were varying from delivering groceries to delivering newspapers to delivering any sort of parts. Um, the the learning has been that it's to enable drone delivery. It needs to be a very well structured, programmed out, phased out process. It's simply thinking of like building a metro project. You have to build phase one, then you have to do phase two, and then you have to do phase three. And it's a slow rollout basically, which checks and balances in place at each and every point to really ensure a sustainable long-term safer environment, because it's not that you have a really high peak during the COVID times and then everyone is using drone delivery and suddenly it goes down and then it dies out again, because these systems will be used day in day out for a really long time, assuming until a better technology comes after this one. So to enable this sort of robotics airline, number one is that you need this sort of program structuring. And number two is you need a very good reason to do it as well. Um, there are existing methods of transportation right now which are already, quite useful in enabling on solving for majority of the troubles. But right now there are very deep pain points basically where the impact or the return on impact basically is the most in those areas which exists in healthcare, which exists within specific areas, which exists within specific products and all of those aspects. And that is not to say that once COVID gets over, whenever that happens, basically, it's also to solve the deeper core issues in healthcare supply chain point of view, specifically with cold chain, essentially. So we number one, we took that viewpoint basically at the start of the part. So we didn't really started delivering immediately or on those parts because it just doesn't work that way, right? Number two is also that aspect that uh, to when you're doing this from a regulatory standpoint, you basically need to provide a lot of data to make sure and to convince the regulators that hey, this is a really safe technology. U.S. Aviation Authority uh, essentially has this motto called walk, crawl, run, fly, basically, to enable drone deliveries. Which is that you start with a really small region, you start delivering with very specific healthcare products, and then you keep expanding slowly on a month by month basis to have a model. And then once you have that model, then you can do that copy pasting throughout the part. So it's that slow gradual process in which we also have to establish the standards. We also have to work with the regulators closely. We have to be very open communication and very articulated with the general public as well about how we are operating, how is this happening, and all of these things which are happening, which are going to happen basically in India, are something which is happening already in the rest of the world. Essentially, Rwanda and Ghana right now are operating at national level drone delivery systems. Right now, Ireland. You can go into a town in Ireland right now, and you can order whatever, like a Dunzo basically, and it comes by drones within
Awesome.
about a 10-15 minutes timeline. So it's the part that when these sort of drone delivery system comes, you need to take the entire community in place, make sure everyone is aware, because you're delivering products essentially by different mechanisms. That drone needs to will be either landing or it'll be the parachuting, or it'll be either dropping very slowly. So those are very sensitive things which need to be worked out with the general public for a specific area, essentially.
Right.
So that's why our approach is to look at a specific area that we have already sort of been working on, and hopefully we'll start doing more, more essentially openness about what we're exactly doing in that area, and then slowly, essentially build from there on to really have the first model in place. And once that happens, you're really building the trust of the regulators simultaneously as well, because like I mentioned, that this is not a technology which will is going to stay for a year or two. Once this is out of the box, then a lot of other people will also be coming in, and then you need to basically build standards for the entire industry, essentially, not just for one player, essentially.
Got it. Got it. So let's, rhetorically, if we were to look at Bangalore needs to have drone delivery for just health tech, right? I'm not even getting into essentials because that would complicate it even more. So how do you think, what is the timeline do you think, Anshul, it would take? Because of course the Bangalore is very widespread. One, second, educating the population is also high. So
Yeah.
what kind of timelines do you think would it really take?
Realistically, I would put in between a 2 to 3 year timeline, basically.
2 to 3 year timeline.
Yeah, for Bangalore.
Wow.
And the reason for that is, and again, this is something from an aviation standpoint, is to do with the return on risk, basically. Bangalore has a very high urban airspace, meaning there's a lot of flights. I'm not sure how much number of flights exactly go from there to Kampagura Airport, but the numbers are on a higher part, similar as with Delhi, similar as with Bombay, similar as with Chennai,
Sure.
Calcutta, and all of these cities which have really dense urban traffic. Now, the reason that why this type of city can't be the first one to have drone delivery, and why a rural area basically is being the first one, basically, is because since the volume of traffic is higher in these sort of urban airspace, the risk profile is higher, basically. There is a quantitative risk method or risk assessment method to determine a risk score, let's say out of 0 to 10, that you can give of enabling drone delivery for the first time in a city like Bangalore versus enabling drone delivery in a rural town of or northeast or any other state, basically, even Karnataka as well.
Sure.
67% of the population of India anyways lives in rural areas, basically. So that's one part. And the second part is that when these sort of technologies are being built simultaneously with a state partner, health partner, or any sort of partnership, essentially, it's really important to do it in a sort of an isolated environment first. Let it work out. Let all the kinks essentially work out, and then start to slowly grow from there. So hence, the model how drone delivery has progressed throughout the world is that it has started first in the peri-urban, semi-rural, and rural regions first, basically, and remote regions, basically. These are the first sort of areas geographically which have adopted drone delivery, and then it started to go from the periphery into the dense part. But I think it's a longer timeline to basically have it exactly in the main major cities like New York or SF or even Bangalore or Delhi or something like that.
Understood.
That will take I think significant time, and at the same time I doubt what exactly would be the exact use case over here, basically.
Sure.
Because drone delivery makes sense on a larger area part, whereas Bangalore population-wise or an urban city population-wise is quite higher, but
Correct.
geographical spread is quite dense.
Right.
I think that will take a little bit kinks to work out. Definitely we'll see like certain pilot projects basically happening within the next, I would say, 2 year timeline. But on a wide scale regular adoption, I definitely do believe that given the precedence of how it has happened for the rest of the world, that the rural, semi-urban, peri-urban regions will be the first ones to get it and to get the first wave of adoption, basically.
So, Anshul, if we can actually talk a little bit more about regulatory aspects, what is it that would actually work for a company like you to be set up in India? Yeah, what are the things that you would probably look forward from, let's say, I don't know if it's state or central that really covers this aspect. Yeah, whatever successes you guys have done elsewhere, would that be applicable, or is it the scenario that we are in, like a COVID-19? That's a scenario that we are in. I'm not really sure. Could you please help us with that?
Yeah. So we've been working with one or two selected states in India for a while now, and we'll be basically seeing more of that coming into public eye essentially in the next, hopefully within this year itself. And the element over here is that since this is the first wave, basically, you also have to build out those industry standards, which is both from a state level and from a central level as well.
Sure.
And second, it's a very sensitive space. So there are multiple central organizations basically which are involved into this space, and all of them are very aware about this sort of technology, have been working to enable it, and have also basically done their part of the bit till now, to really make sure that we're not falling behind in those sort of industry standards. Now it's just solving those very small, minute initial kinks essentially, because we're on the verge of operationalizing it.
Oh, very nice.
And at the same time, just going a little bit slow initially, basically, so that all stakeholders have visibility, communication, and a real simple visualization of the impact essentially which happens. It's just that that's the right way to go. It's difficult to put the same sort of or it's difficult to basically move this forward if you are trying to suggest a use case of delivering food in a city like Bangalore, or some other sort of use case essentially which is more urban centric. But perpetually changing a healthcare supply chain and solving those problems basically which just cannot be solved by general form of logistics is something which is a very deepful and impactful story to have basically. A really simple example is just in the case of emergency care, that's the most intuitive one which comes to anyone's mind, is solving just for emergency care logistics.
Right.
That's a really big problem which happens each and every day, and now we're practically sitting at the peak of the COVID essentially. So these sort of issues are very difficult, almost like it's almost impossible to basically solve via a general form of logistics to enable emergency care. Like, how do you, in healthcare, the products are always limited. You don't have them in abundance, and then you need it at a geographical location at any point of time, at any time of the day as well, and then and you have a time constraint on it as well. So it's very difficult to solve that problem with a general form of logistics, basically, if you're not using this technology. So that's just one use case. And then, the problems that we discussed earlier about wastage and all of those other parts. So it's essentially, working with the state health departments, that's at the state level, to collect that data, make that case, and they've always already certain state health governments in India are very well aware of, have been looking at all the hardcore data which has come out of the African nations and all the other countries basically, because it's been live for more than 3 to 4 years now. So now there is viable data on the specific impact of drone delivery system on the healthcare supply chain, and they're aware that what sort of impact that it can have in India when you're looking at a population which is much more denser in African regions, when you're looking at population which has much more varieties of healthcare products which are needed. So all of those aspects are something which will really help in educating other stakeholders, and at the same time moving this at a specific space. But the element over here is that since there are since we're being in the early wave right now, it's important to have a real clear program structure in mind on how this technology is supposed to move and what sort of geographical areas it makes sense, and then basically suggest to everyone, all stakeholders, that this is how we should be moving, and then go on from there on.
Wow, this is so much of stuff, right? Because when you look at it from the outside, when people talk about drones, it's supposed to be the most cool thing. And when you actually deep dive and look at it, there are so many. It's not just. I wouldn't call it when you look at logistics segment, right, there are parts of it that you have to cover. Here, there are three aspects you have to cover. Plus, there is a lot of security weightage to the whole piece that you have to get a sign off from multiple departments, right? So when loads of people talk about drone, it's not spoken about in this specific context, if I may say so, right? Mostly when we speak about drones, our eyes light up and we think it's more like a one of the aeroplanes that we are trying to fly, and it has got so many things behind this, Anshul. So in most of the articles that I've read about Red Wings and I've seen about you guys, I think there's one prominent aspect that they keep talking about. How did you youngsters come up with something so strong in terms of a sense that you wanted to run, right? Because you were very clear that this is not going to be something cool. This is going to be towards an impact creation for health, yeah. And there is a personal angle to it. The question that we were discussing when we before we got in here, right? How will it work in the long run? How do you see this actually becoming the landscape for Red Wings?
Since we're basically, still have some youth basically left in us, it makes a little bit easy when you're trying to build a deep tech business or a deep tech sort of company when you're a little bit younger, essentially. In the part, it's a little bit difficult to do it perhaps when you're a little bit.
A lot of founders are not going to like this, by the way.
Yeah, but it's just like it's mentally a little bit easier because you just have a little bit more time,
Sure.
at least on the mental space part. But at the same time, the advantage what happens or the easier aspect is that since you know that this will take, it has teething issues to basically solve for, and at the same time, you are simultaneously doing a bunch of different stuff while those teething issues are getting solved, like in a typical deep tech part. And at the same time, you also have that element of regulatory environment, right? Which is also something which is common for medtech and biotech startups, essentially. Which is also common for space tech startups. It is also common for a lot of deep tech
Sure.
companies, basically.
Sure.
So, we have those similar set of challenges, essentially, and from a near-term future and a long-term future, as you want to call it, we're pretty clear on how this is going to basically be rolled out.
Okay.
It's that you need to develop this technology, you need to test it thoroughly, you need to communicate with stakeholders, you need to present that data, essentially. And while you're doing this, you're also essentially enabling slowly, depending on the risk profile, essentially, of the particular space. The focus for the next at least 12 to 18 months is really doing these sort of early phases of basically delivery deployments, and focusing on the use case that we're focusing on,
Right.
and going in a phase-wise manner, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is this early small scale part, and then phase 2 you can look at simply as a medium scale part, and then phase 3 is your large scale part. And when you're rolling it out in a phase-wise manner, what happens is that you're collecting data at the end of each phases, and that is giving both the regulators and all the stakeholders involved enough confidence, essentially, to keep expanding those boundary conditions, essentially. And once those, let's say, experiments are basically done successfully,
Right.
then you can basically start to copy paste that model, essentially, in places where it makes sense on that part. So I think we will be, from a 12 to 18 months timeline, doing that, basically, running those, like, we're calling them experiments, even though they are
you are going to keep the essence of the company, right? In terms of saying, hey, the vision was to look at impacting people, making sure that your rural areas get their medicines on time. In fact, that's what was running in my head. You're going to keep that essence going, is what you're saying.
Yeah. We're actually not looking at any other sort of a use case right now.
Sure.
As well.
Sure.
Doesn't make too much sense, especially from the context of this pandemic itself.
Right.
It makes the most sense to to showcase, communicate very clearly that this is the exact use case and this is the exact benefit. Because, like I mentioned, the drone delivery makes sense to, like, for a lot of different cases. It makes sense for enabling like very fast on-demand e-commerce logistics or food logistics or a bunch of different items which will happen in the due course of time. But enabling it for this specific use case of healthcare will will solve a very long-term, systematic problem essentially in the supply chain. And yes, it's a slow and medium actually journey to go there.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
How is it in terms of hiring? This is such a complicated space,
Yeah.
a new space for India. How do you find your engineers? How do you find your people? Do you want to talk about that a little, or maybe attract them through this podcast?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Thank you so much for that shout out. Yeah, we're the learning in terms of hiring for us has been that we've basically looked at people who've had certain sort of experience with robotics, either in college time or either in after they went into the normal workforce. So I think on the tech hiring part, it has been primarily looking at people who've either had a background in aerospace or either had a background in robotics, or have done bunch of cool projects essentially in college.
sure.
We're really big fans basically of people who've done just like made something incredible or like just something goofy as well in college times basically. Played around with robotics, played around with bunch of different stuff essentially in college, from both hardware and software level essentially. So that has been the primary part, and then of course it all happens that all deep tech startups basically the challenge which face is that since it's a little bit longer gestation, it's not that you're hitting a monthly 100k MRR or any of those MAUs metrics or those sort of parts to really go for. You're really looking at more focus on the product metrics basically at that point of time.
Sure.
So
So patience is the game.
yeah,
here.
the patience is definitely a game. So I would say robotics plus patience is the perfect combo that we look at.
Sure,
basically.
sure. So, how do you think people can write to you? If you can talk about the handlers, are you on LinkedIn, Twitter? How do
Yeah,
they get in touch with you?
yeah, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. You can just type Redwing Labs, and you'll find us basically. And you can just shoot us a mail essentially on what sort of position that you want to look at, and yeah, we can take it from there on.
Sure. Before we wrap up, would you have any last few words for the audience who's looking at this podcast, whether be it from an engineering perspective or maybe the VC community who's looking at you? So, would you have a few words for them?
Um, I haven't thought of that basically, but I think it's just basically important to bring some clarity on and a little bit more realistic point of view in terms of looking at, let's say, drone delivery space essentially, and looking at from a more systems engineering perspective and a more structured way out essentially, rather than thinking that why is it not happening? It's been so many years. We were promised drone delivery in 2013 by Jeff Bezos. Yeah, that was the first time it was announced. And it's been 7-8 years, and why it's not happening. But the reality of it is that it's happening in a lot of countries right now. It's just happening at a slow, controlled pace, and yeah, I think that's the way that it's going to happen with India as well, and the rest of the other places as well, which are remaining.
Sure. I think for all the VCs and all the people that are listening to this show, I would like to mention that a slow, informed growth would mean that it's going to be a proper process that's going to be in place, because of which the errors that would happen would probably be mitigated to a large extent. And I think you're in that line of business where security and regulations, the framework itself is going to keep it so tight that you have to make this happen. One time if there is a delivery, it can't go and deliver somewhere else, because we're
Sure.
talking about people's lives, we're talking about vaccines getting delivered, right? I think this is fantastic what you guys are doing. Even though if the growth is really, really slow, I think most VCs who have the mindset of making an impact in making sure that people get what they need. Yeah. So I think they would definitely be interested in you guys. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of luck for you guys, and I hope you guys do well this year and the next year and onwards as well.
Thank you so much, Rupa. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Anshul, for being on our show.